always had this gut feeling that if something ever happened to my dad, somebody needed to check her out. And that's what Scott Ferris said when his father, Gary Ferris, was found dead on their family property. And the her that he mentions, he's talking about his own mom, Gary's wife of nearly 3 decades. I mean, can you imagine growing up in a family where you not only believed, but had a weird gut feeling that one of your parents could actually be capable of killing the other? Well, that's exactly the kind of family that we're dealing with today. And it's not just a case of a son accusing his mother, it's also a case of a mother accusing her son right back. So not only are we dealing with a murdered father, but 2 of his beloved family members are the likeliest suspects, and both are pitted against one another, and it all comes down to money, greed, and betrayal. Welcome back to another video. I just want to thank everyone for all the positive comments that I've been seeing. I really appreciate all the words of encouragement. It means a lot, and I'm really happy to see that people are as interested in these cases as I am. Now, today's case is not as gory or horrible as some of the other ones we've done on this channel, but it is packed with a lot of tension and family drama. And I've already talked about so many cases where families are torn apart by a criminal case and trial, but this particular family was already a complete mess before the story even started. So today, we're going to Atlanta, Georgia to meet the Ferris family. It's 2018, July 5th, the day after 4th of July. And as we all know, that's America's Independence Day, where everyone is celebrating together, eating good food, fireworks, and we're in Cherokee County, Georgia, where there's a concerned family that's searching for their missing father. 58-year-old Gary Ferris, he was meant to join with his family for celebration on the 4th of July, but he never actually showed up. And since then, nobody has seen or heard from him at all, including his 4 adult children and his wife. Now, the property that this family lives on is this huge 10-acre wooded forest land property that has a barn, a farm, you name it. And they're thinking, okay, we haven't seen him in over a day or so, but he has to be somewhere around here. It wasn't considered to be that unusual if you went a day or so without seeing anybody, because that's just how big their place is. But it was just a little weird because Gary is a family man, and it just really wasn't like him to miss a family get together, especially a holiday as important to any American, the 4th of July. So they thought this is a little bit strange. So the family kind of splits up. We have Gary's wife, Melody, and their 4 children, who I'll, introduce them to you guys in a little bit. But essentially they're going around this huge property searching for him, and they kind of split up and they take, their own different paths. Now, the initial thoughts that some of them had when they were searching for him was, what if Gary just had a heart attack somewhere and he's just passed out on the ground, or even worse, something really bad has happened to him. And it's not that weird that they were thinking that, because Gary was actually known for having a lot of health and physical problems. He would apparently drink a case of Mountain Dew a day. He was a heavy smoker. Of course, these are not the most healthiest things to be doing. So he did have high blood pressure. He took medication for it. And he was known to have a lot of these really intense sick spells where he would just get really sick out of the blue and get really physically weak. So his family was really worried that perhaps something like this had happened to him. Even though the family had some concerns that something possibly health related happened to Gary, something kind of stuck out to them that was a little weird. And it was the fact that they could see his RTV was parked near the main house. And if you don't know what an RTV is, just imagine kind of a tractor looking vehicle. And it's usually driven around properties like a farm or whatnot to, carry really heavy things. And it's just something that you kind of use to get around or do heavy duty stuff with. And this was something that Gary used to get around the property, because it was just that big. Walking from point A to B would take a really long time. So he would drive around on this RTV. Now, the fact that it was still parked by the main house meant that he could not be that far. Surely he must be somewhere close by. Now, this huge 10-acre farm that they're searching through, let me just try to give you guys a bit of a visual as to how insane this Ferris farm is. So it's 10 acres of woodlands and open fields. And if you want to know just how big that is, it's around 8 football fields side by side to one another. So it's huge. No wonder Gary drove an RTV around. Now, on this property, they had pretty much everything, you name it. They had a huge farmhouse, they had barns, they had fenced pastures, they had wooded areas, open fields, they had a pond, they had bunch of animals all over the place. So because they had all of these things, it kind of felt like more of a private rural estate rather than just like a random suburban home. And now this huge field, right, where the property is, the very back of it was the main house where Gary and his wife, Melody Ferris, lived in. So it was just the two of them in that huge house. And they had this really long driveway leading up to it. So even just getting to the main house from like the beginning of where the property starts is a bit of a long walk. Like you're probably not going to want to walk on that really long gravel road. Ideally, you drive up there, take a horse even. They had a bunch of horses on the property, or an RTV. Now behind the main house, they kind of had a barn there and some equipment sheds, kind of standard stuff to have when you're living on that kind of property with a farm and whatnot. And large portions of their land was wooded, which means that there was a lot of trees there. So you're kind of out of sight if you were to like kind of be deep down into the wooded area. So even if you're on the property and someone is very far away and they know you're there, they probably wouldn't even be able to see you because of just how many trees there are and how dense it is. Like many rural properties, the farm had a designated burn pile. And if you don't know what that is, it's essentially just a pile for throwing away debris and brush and like any sort of vegetation. It's essentially a waste pile, and you would essentially set it on fire and like burn it. So that's what they also had on their property. And it's a pretty normal thing to have, especially when you're managing a land this size. Now, even the community outside of where the Ferris family lived viewed their property as this kind of huge estate. They were really well known locally just because of how big it was. And most homes surrounding that area were much smaller suburban lots in comparison. So from afar to anyone else outside of that house, you're looking in like, wow, that place is insane. And apparently there was also a little bit of a nickname for the Ferris farm. They called it the Ferris wheel. And we'll get a little bit into it later as to why they called it that. Clearly, Gary had done very well financially. I mean, the huge size and scale of this property reflected his success. He earned all of his money on his own and he worked very, very hard for it. Now, to people in the community, it kind of looked like an ideal Southern family setup. They have a large home, plenty of land, animals, and a successful father supporting his family. But now with Gary missing and the family searching for him, but the property so large that the search pretty much just spreads across and everyone has to split up to look for him, one of the sons, his name was Scott Ferris, kind of walks further out on his own away from like his sisters and his mom and kind of heads towards the back portion of the property. And while he's kind of walking around, he notices the burn pile. And the pile kind of stands out to him because it looked freshly burned, which means, someone had just lit it up and like set everything on fire because all the ashes are still dark and a bit disturbed. And he kind of realizes like, oh, that's a little bit weird. So he goes closer to it to take a look. Now, at first, all he sees is, the usual charred debris and ash, what you would expect to see. But as he's looking through it, something kind of catches his eyes. And when he takes a closer look, he sees that something is mixed in with the ashes and they're bone fragments. So he squats down to get a better look. And within seconds, a horrible realization sets in. These aren't animal bones. These are human remains. Quickly and frantically, Scott, realizing what he's seeing, pulls out his phone and immediately calls 911. And he tells dispatchers that he believes he found human bones on their property in the burn pile. Now, very quickly after that, deputies from Cherokee County Sheriff's Office arrive at the farm. And what had originally started as a simple search for a missing family member now begins to look like something a lot more serious. The area is quickly secured around the burn pile and they start examining the ashes. Very quickly, it becomes clear that this is no longer just a welfare check. This is now the beginning of a homicide investigation. We know the Ferris family lives on this huge property, but who was the Ferris family? Gary Ferris was a really well-known Atlanta commercial real estate attorney, and he had decades of success behind him. He essentially built his wealth all through his career, and he earned every single bit of it. He was a very, very hardworking man. Now, people in his family, he was very well loved. They called him Big Daddy. Like his grandkids, kids and his own children refer to him as Big Daddy. And this was mostly because Gary was a huge guy. I'm talking like 6'5", 300 pounds. So he is a really tall, big guy. So all of his kids and grandkids would call him Big Daddy. And he was known overall to be a pretty good father. He supported all of his family members because of his incredible wealth. He loved to spoil his children. But sometimes he could also be a little bit controlling and stubborn. But to be fair, like what dad isn't a little bit stubborn in some sense? Now, Gary was the primary financial provider of the family. His wife, Melody, at the time of this case in 2018, they were both 58 years old. She kind of helped manage the day-to-day life on the farm. So it was mostly Gary that was bringing in the money. Like he was the primary breadwinner and pretty much provided everything for their family. Now, Melody and Gary were the only ones who lived together on their property in the main house. Their son, Scott Ferris, also lived on the property. So he was the only one that actually lived with his parents, but not in the same house. He lived in the barn that was on the property in a sort of like renovated flat right above it. So, I mean, it's kind of nice for him and it was an ideal situation because he can kind of live there rent-free a little bit. It was essentially his childhood home anyways. He grew up there. So for him, he had a pretty nice situation. Now for Melody, she took care of a lot of things around the property. She pretty much managed all of the like technical things and, managing the animals, taking care of the health of the property. And of course, they had a lot of people working there as well, like also maintaining the property because it's a huge place. But that's pretty much all she did for the majority of the time that they were married. She wasn't really working. She didn't really have a career for herself. Now, Melody and Gary were married for several decades and they had 4 children together. Now, at the time of this case, their children were all adults. They were all fully grown up. They had their own family and their own kids. And for them, this property, the Ferris farm, was their family home, their childhood home. So introducing the Ferris kids, we'll start off with Chris Ferris. He is the eldest of 4 children. And at the time of this investigation, he was living in Texas with his own family. He worked in technology in the IT sector, and he was someone who was quite methodical and analytical, a lot of people said. And this becomes important later on because he helps detectives essentially piece together a lot of the timeline and evidence for this case. Now, the next kid of the Ferris family is Scott Ferris. And as I mentioned, he lives on the property and he also helps out. He kind of works on the property and Gary actually pays him for his work. So it really seems like they have a pretty good dynamic going on there. He did work in construction and contracting for quite some time. So he has the experience and he's a pretty hands-on type of person. So it's actually a really ideal situation for him to continue living on his family property and just like helping out the best that he can. Now, the next sibling is Emily Ferris. And keep in mind that we don't have too much access to personal information about the Ferris kids because we only know what is public information. So this is the best that I could find about everyone. But anyhow, Emily, she lived out of state and apparently she lived in North Carolina with her own family, but she still remained pretty close to her dad. Like all of the kids had pretty good relationship with Gary. And Emily described Gary as someone who was a really devoted father who really helped her out financially. Like he essentially financially supported her and his grandchildren, aka Emily's kids, whenever they needed the help. Now, the next kid is Amanda Ferris, and she is the youngest of the 4 siblings. She also had a really close relationship with both of her parents, more so with her mom, Melody. And by the time of this case, she also pretty much had her own life outside of the farm. So even though all siblings had their own lives during this time, they still all maintained really strong ties to their family and the home that they had pretty much grown up in. So to find out that human remains, which could possibly belong to their dad, was found, it wasn't just a childhood home anymore. It was now a crime scene and the killer was possibly amongst them. So even though the Ferris family appeared to be really successful and close to one another from the outside, the inside of that family was far more complicated, especially when it came to money. Now, as we know, Gary is very financially successful. He worked hard for his money. The property reflects all of that. But he also continued to financially support all of his children in various ways. He had apparently invested money into Chris's business ventures. So he pretty much helped his son get projects off of the ground. He helped Emily with finances and supported her children, his grandchildren, whenever they needed it. And Amanda also had frequent financial aid from Gary as well. So Gary essentially helped his kids whenever they needed any sort of financial support. Pretty much no questions asked. They always had a backup. So these kids, they pretty much grew up their entire life and even into their adult lives just never having to worry about money and always knowing that no matter what, their dad would be there to help them in whatever situation. And that is a huge privilege that not a lot of us can relate to, but it also reflects the dynamic and relationship that the kids had with their dad. And look, I'm not involved in their family or their personal life. None of us are. We can only assume so much from what we see and what we know based on the information that is released to the public. However, we can kind of assume sometimes money makes things a little bit messy, right? And surely sometimes having all of this, financial security and aid from their dad can possibly lead to a bit of tension and jealousy between siblings as well. And not even between siblings, but possibly between Melody. Now, Melody, she benefited the most from Gary's financial success. This huge property, the Ferris farm, as they call it, with animals and a barn and everything, this was Melody's dream. This is what she wanted. And Gary essentially helped make her dreams come true. And Melody was very adamant about the fact that she was a good wife. She took care of a lot of things on the property. There was never any unfaithfulness in their relationship. There was never anything weird or suspicious going on between her and Gary. This is what Melody had claimed. And she did tell investigators, as all of this personal information is being revealed throughout the investigation, she did tell them that Gary had no life insurance and there was essentially no assets in her name. As investigators were uncovering more about the financial drama within the family, Melody was very quick to put blame on her children. Yeah, she was blaming her kids and pretty much said that her kids were taking advantage of Gary's wealth. And she accused a number of things towards her children. So it wasn't just, the potential tension and jealousy that can arise between siblings when your parents are spoiling you. Their own mother basically accused them of treating Gary like an ATM machine and taking advantage of him. All of the siblings, besides Amanda though, according to Melody. Now, she said that Chris was stealing money from Gary. And not only that, she also blamed her other son, Scott. So both of her sons she was accusing and saying that he was misusing Gary's credit cards and also leeching off of Gary. Because Scott was the only kid out of all of them that was living on the property, he was the only one that pretty much saw his parents every single day, who was still actively involved in their lives. And because of that, Melody was able to see what he does in his day-to-day. And she constantly was saying like, oh, Scott's not really doing anything. He's just leeching off Gary. He's always just off playing golf, hanging out with his friends, not really doing anything useful. She essentially painted this picture of her own children apparently being really irresponsible, and that Gary was getting really fed up with them and potentially really close to cutting ties with them. And not cutting them off as in like they're never going to speak to one another again, but cutting them off financially and saying, hey, it's time for you guys to, be independent. So she was pretty much implying that perhaps some of her children, like her two sons, could maybe have ulterior motives towards Gary in terms of the money that is involved. But the sons pushed back. When they heard that Melody was accusing them, they said that they had a very different story and that what she was saying was not true at all and that she was just throwing fingers around. Scott was saying that he regularly does work on the farm and he likes to help out. He has experience in that field and he has pretty much an agreement with Gary that whatever work Scott does on the farm, Gary will pay him for it. So it wasn't like he was just, getting a handout or leeching off of his dad. They had an agreement with one another and that he was getting actively paid for his work, which to me, that makes complete and total sense. So why would Melody be saying otherwise? Like, that's all very, very weird. And not only that, Chris also said that Melody's claims were basically just BS. And he said that any financial help that he did get from Gary was all given very willingly and all in good faith. Like, there was never any tension or ambiguity between anybody, like Melody was saying. So it seemed like Melody was the only one who was making up all of these things about having tension within the family and whatnot. It kind of seemed like Melody was in the center of all of this tension and all of this. Chris said that he never stole, he never manipulated his dad. In fact, Chris told investigators that Melody's portrayal of the family simply just wasn't true at all. Of course, money can get really complicated for a lot of reasons, especially within families, but according to Chris and Scott, it really seemed like everyone had a good relationship with Gary, and it was only Melody that was implying otherwise. Now, there's a slow shift in suspicion now throughout the investigation. The most important part of their statements wasn't just the denial and saying, that's not true, that's not true. Both Chris and Scott told investigators something else. So now there's a little bit of a shift as investigators are kind of, eyeing everyone in the family and trying to figure out who could have been involved in Gary's murder. Now they're kind of starting to look towards Melody after she just started pointing the fingers at everybody. And the two sons suggested a couple of things. They said that if detectives were looking for somebody capable of harming Gary, that they should take a closer look at Melody herself. They said that their mom had a really volatile personality, and one of them told investigators that Melody was someone you did not want to make angry. She loved the drama, so they said. And with that, the focus on the investigation begins to shift, and they would soon learn that Melody didn't just have problems with her own sons, but her marriage with Gary actually had its own serious problems, and it was not good at all. It wasn't as healthy as she had claimed it to be. By 2018, Gary and Melody's marriage was really deeply strained, and a lot of witnesses, mostly their own children, described that they had constant arguments, all the time, and all of their arguments, most of it had to do with money, control of the family finances, and basically the future of Gary's assets and the property overall. So over time, because of all of these arguments over money, they started growing emotionally distant towards one another. One of the things that investigators could see straight off the bat as they were investigating and exploring the main house was the fact that Gary slept separately from Melody. They didn't sleep in the same room or in the same bed. He had his own room in the basement, and he actually spent a lot of his time there. It was mostly because Gary suffered with sleep apnea, and that's essentially a condition that makes it quite difficult for you to breathe on your own, especially when you're sleeping. So he would also use a CPAP machine, which would help him breathe as he slept. And this machine does make quite a lot of noise. It could perhaps be a little bit disruptive to someone sleeping next to you. So because of that, they said they slept separately, but you could see it was also for other reasons, because they just weren't getting along anymore and their marriage was pretty much slowly falling apart. I just wanted to say, when I read that Gary spent a lot of his time in the basement and that he was sleeping there, I actually felt really sad for him, because I was thinking about the fact that this huge farmland property that they have was all earned and bought by Gary with his money and his hard work, yet he's the one who's sleeping in the basement. And I'm sure, I don't want to imply anything, but I'm sure Melody probably had something to do with that. Why was he not sleeping in just another guest room? But maybe he wanted to sleep in the basement. We won't ever know. Now, the environment inside of the household, inside of the Ferris farm, there was a lot of tension. It was very volatile overall. You have family arguing over money, responsibility, and pretty much the entire control of the farm. So beneath the surface of this, what looks like on the outside a really successful, wealthy family, there was actually a lot of resentment building between the people living there. We return back to the scene of the burn pile when it was first found by Scott, and now deputies are there, a bunch of investigators, and they've essentially now set up a whole perimeter around it. There's a lot of people on the scene. It's an active crime scene at this point, and they have located the bone fragments, and it's quite clear to everyone that these are human, but they still need to confirm who these fragments belong to. So they send the remains to a crime lab up for forensic analysis. And even though it was quite, the condition of the bones was, was lit on fire. Okay, so the bones aren't like well put together and whatnot. It's a little bit charred. It's a little bit hard to tell. But luckily, through dental and forensic records, they were able to identify the remains as Gary Ferris. Now, upon further inspection, they actually saw that one of the bone fragments had evidence of a gunshot wound. It seemed like Gary had actually been shot with a .38 caliber bullet, and that was actually lodged into the rib cage. Now that they know that Gary was shot, but his remains were found in the burn pile, that means that he was shot first, most likely, and that someone had moved him into the burn pile afterwards. And there's usually only one reason as to why someone would light a body on fire, and that's to destroy evidence. At this point in the investigation led by Detective Daniel Hayes, they had already confirmed something really critical, that the remains found in the burn pile did indeed belong to Gary Ferris. So now they're starting to reconstruct the crime. They need to figure out, where was Gary shot? Like, where did the shooting take place? And one of the things that you can do to figure that out is looking for blood. Trails of blood will obviously tell you where the shooting happened. But when they took a closer look at the burn pile, they noticed that there was actually no evidence of blood whatsoever, which meant one thing, that Gary was not shot by the burn pile. He had been shot somewhere else, and then somebody had moved his body to that location after the shooting. Now, not only do investigators have to figure out where he got shot, but they also need to figure out, of course, who shot him, but they need to find the gun. Who did this gun belong to? Where could it possibly be? Now, during an interview, Scott told investigators something interesting. He said that he had seen a pistol in the basement somewhat prior to all of this. But when investigators went to go look for it, it was not there anymore. So possibly that could have been the same pistol that shot Gary, but they have no idea where it went or what happened to it. It was essentially never found. It was just a comment that Scott made and like a slight possibility that it could have been the gun that shot and killed Gary. Now, Detective Hayes and investigators begin expanding their search across the property, and it's a huge place, so it takes some time for them to check everything. Like, especially in a crime scene where someone has been murdered, you're gonna have to look very thoroughly, and they check everywhere. The barn, even the pond. They even had divers checking the pond, and they checked everywhere that they could. Now, inside the main house, as they're searching through for some evidence, they use Blue Star testing, which is basically a test that allows them to see fresh, dried, or even cleaned up blood, because of course they needed to check if there was any blood in the house. And they did find some, but it was very, very minimal. They saw that there was actually droplets of blood, basically a trail leading from the kitchen down to the stairs to the basement. And the basement is, of course, where Gary spent most of his time, where he slept. And the basement becomes a very important location because there was clear evidence of an attempted cleanup of blood. So this indicates that someone was clearly trying to get rid of evidence, and that possibly this could have been the place where Gary was shot. Not only that, there was something else that was a little bit strange that stuck out to investigators. When they were looking throughout the house, they actually found a bullet casing near a rug on the floor. This is in the living room area. Again, they have proof that he was shot inside of the home. They have a trail of blood leading down into the basement, although the basement has attempted cleanup of blood, but the bullet casing that they found is in the living room on the floor near a rug. Like, everything about that just doesn't really make a lot of sense because there's also no blood near the bullet. There's no hole in the wall or the floor to show any sort of bullet trajectory. It almost feels like as if someone just pretty much dropped the casing there, and it just felt really random to investigators to even find it there. But at this point, they kind of did have a working theory that most likely Gary had been shot inside the home, possibly near or in the basement. But the biggest mystery remained. How did Gary's body end up in the burn pile? The reason this was so weird was because Gary was a huge guy. He's 6'5", 300 pounds. Moving a body of that size across a huge property would definitely have left some sort of forensic trace. Anything like drag marks, blood, any sort of residue. But when they looked for it, they found nothing. There was no evidence of a body being dragged or moved at all. So at this point, they still need to figure out when the killing happened. They kind of have a little bit of an idea as to where Gary was shot. But not only that, they need to figure out who did this. So they start talking more to the family and trying to figure out where was Gary's last known whereabouts before he was killed. Who was the last person to have seen Gary? Now we're going back to July 3rd. So 2 days before his remains in the burn pile was found and before the start of the entire investigation. Now, as they were talking to family members, they spoke to Melody, and she was the last person to see Gary alive. She saw him the last time was on the evening of July 3rd, and Gary asked Melody if there was something for dinner, something to eat, and she basically just told him, like, go get food yourself, there's something in the fridge, which, like, poor guy, he just wanted something to eat. So he goes down to the basement looking for some food, and that was pretty much the last time and the last conversation, essentially, that Gary and Melody had with one another. Like, this is what Melody had claimed. Now, what's interesting, going back to the basement, as I mentioned before, is a really important place for a lot of reasons. Not only because they found evidence of an attempted cleanup there that possibly indicates Gary was shot in the basement, but there is a particular machine that Gary used, his CPAP machine, that actually stored and recorded a ton of data. And when they took a look at it, they saw that Gary did not use this machine on the night of July 3rd. And not only that, Gary's phone also showed that he returned home from a restaurant that he was at around 9:30 p.m. So now they were able to see that he died sometime around in the evening between like 9:30 p.m. to 1 a.m. Knowing this, investigators quickly realized something really troubling. There's only 2 people who were on the property that night: Melody and their son, Scott. Scott said he wasn't home until around 11:30 p.m. and this is verified because he was at a friend's house, and outside his friend's house there was a surveillance camera that caught him leaving at around 10:55, and it takes him around 30 minutes to get home from there. Now, Scott was very quick to blame his mom for the murder of Gary. Within essentially 30 minutes of police arriving on scene, he pretty much pointed the finger at his mom straight away. And already throughout the investigation, we know that there's been a lot of finger pointing, Melody, accusing her sons of being leeches and, stealing Gary's money, trying to imply that perhaps they had a motive or whatnot. But Scott as well, he was the first to accuse his mom and very quick to do so. In a recorded interview with police, he even says, "I always had this gut feeling that if something ever happened to my dad, somebody needed to check her out." He said by the time he got home on the evening of the 3rd at around 11:30 p.m., like midnight-ish, he saw a glow in the distance, like across the property, and it was the burn pile. So he could see that it was already lit in the distance, but he assumed his dad set it on fire because his dad did tell him before, "Oh, I have to get rid of like an old tree stump later, so I'm going to be doing the burn pile." So when Scott saw the fire in the distance on that night, he didn't think too much about it. Now, Scott kind of has an alibi, and it seems like Melody is the primary suspect at this point. Suspicion is falling onto her, and Scott is also accusing his mom, which, by the way, that's kind of crazy. Like, your dad has been murdered, you found his remains, and the first person you think who did it is your own mother. I just really can't imagine what must be going through his head during that time. So with Scott accusing his mom and the slow reveal throughout the investigation that Melody and Gary did in fact have, not a stable marriage, they were emotionally distant, they weren't even sleeping in the same room, and most of all, she was the last person to see him alive. Like, it's not looking very good for her. Now, Melody claimed when she was asked about all of this, she said, "Well, I thought Gary had left the property that night, but that doesn't make sense because his truck never left. His RTV was still there." And she pretty much turns around and points the finger to Scott. Okay, so bear with me here. There's a lot of finger pointing and accusations being thrown around. So in a quick summary, Scott was the first one to accuse Melody of doing something to Gary, like very quickly when deputies arrived on scene and said all of these things. The Melody said, "Actually, no, I think Scott was the one who killed Gary." She claimed that Scott and Gary had a lot of violent arguments. A lot of them had to do with money. She said that Scott was actually very hot-tempered. And then after Melody had claimed all of these things against Scott, trying to make it seem like, he had something to do with his dad's death, Scott obviously denied all of this and said, "That's not true. Me and Dad had a great relationship, actually, and everything Melody is saying is not true at all. And he went on to say that something was really weird. He said that he found Gary's wallet in Melody's possession. And the reason that was weird was because Gary only ever had his wallet in two spots, either in his pocket or on his bedside table. So when Scott saw that his mom had his dad's wallet, and he was like, "How did you get that?" Or like, "Why do you have it?" She said that she found it in the truck. So to him, immediately, that was like a red flag, and he thought that was like super, super weird. Nonetheless, even though they were both accusing each other, investigators can't actually arrest anyone yet unless they have concrete evidence, right? But they obviously have plenty of information to kind of figure out who really is the murderer here. Nonetheless, they test Melody and Scott's hands for accelerants just to see if they have any evidence of shooting a gun recently, but both of their tests actually came back negative. So at this point, the detectives are at a little bit of a standstill. They technically have two suspects, Scott and Melody, but they don't have enough evidence to pinpoint a primary suspect until they've really started looking through Melody's belongings. As investigators are looking through Melody's stuff, they find her purse and they go through it. And there are some things that they find that, yeah, there's a red flag there. They find birth control pills, which kind of indicates that she's being, sexually active. And it most likely isn't with Gary, since we know their marriage was pretty strained. But they also found a credit card in there belonging to a Rusty Burton. But who is Rusty? Who is this other man? Well, he lived in Tennessee, and he's actually the stepson of Melody's cousin. Yeah, let that sink in for a second, because he was also the man that she was having an affair with for several months before all of this. So this wasn't just some sort of like spur in the moment thing, like an impulse one night stand. They were together for the long term. Now, Rusty also worked on the property. He worked on the farm. He had irregular access. And because of that, they ended up becoming like in frequent contact with one another. So over time, their relationship became romantic, and they were constantly calling, they were constantly texting. But it gets worse, because apparently their affair was hardly a secret. Melody's children knew about the affair. Gary knew about the affair. This wasn't some secret. Investigators find out, and they're kind of like, oh, this changes things a little bit, but everyone else already knew about this. So of course, this adds even more tension to an already really volatile dynamic within the family. Scott pretty much called it the world's worst kept secret. And it somehow gets worse, because prior to all of this, like way before, when their daughter Emily was getting married, and it was her wedding, her special day, where, the attention should be on the two people getting married, Melody brought Rusty to the wedding, the man that she was having an affair with, that everyone knew she was cheating on Gary with. She brought him to the wedding as her +1. So Melody didn't even go to her own daughter's wedding with her husband, like a family event, celebrating love and everything. It's supposed to be super wholesome. She brought her, oh my gosh, it's crazy. She brought her boyfriend. I cannot imagine how Emily must have felt. So all of this just shows that Melody's behavior is consistent. This is something that she's been doing for a very long time, manipulating people, accusing people. So it seems like what Scott and Chris mentioned earlier about the fact that Melody loves the drama. Clearly, it's very true. There's a ton of evidence that speaks to this. So it's not just like suddenly when this case happened and Gary's remains were found, Melody is trying to seem very like, our marriage is fine, actually, like all of this, all of that. No. It's very, very clear that she is essentially a narcissist. And what I think is just the cherry on top is the fact that Melody is accusing her own children of taking financial advantage of Gary. I feel like this is super hypocritical of her, because Melody had actually spent thousands of dollars on her affair with Rusty. There's financial records that show she went on vacations with him, spending a lot of money on these really expensive, extravagant trips with Gary's money. on another man. Yet she is here accusing her own children of taking advantage of him. Now, not too long before Gary's passing, there were text exchanges between him and Melody. And Gary had actually texted Melody saying, "Your spending is done. We've got to get a handle on this." There's also a couple of more text messages that basically allude to the fact that Gary was pretty much getting really fed up. Like, he was at his wits' ends with this. So investigators later discovered that there's evidence suggesting Melody and Rusty were also looking at wedding bands. Okay, so this reveal of new information is really important to the case because now it's showing Melody's motive. She's pointing the fingers at her son and saying, oh, they have all of this like financial, ulterior motive and whatnot, implying all of these things. But here she is looking at wedding bands with another man. Perhaps she was worried that Gary may wanted to divorce her, split up with her, and therefore she would lose access to all of his money, all the assets, the property. As she mentioned earlier to investigators, Gary didn't have any life insurance. She had no claim to any of his assets. She has essentially spent 30 years as a homemaker, a stay-at-home mom, raising children. So she doesn't have any of her own savings. She doesn't have a career to back her up. And also because of her age, I can imagine if Gary were to divorce her, she would pretty much have nothing. She would have nothing. Everything was earned and owned by Gary. Now, this is probably a fear that a lot of women have, when you spend a lot of time with your partner and you dedicate yourself to motherhood and you don't really have a career behind you and also your age. It is just the unfortunate reality of the situation. And I'm not trying to justify anything whatsoever at all, but to rather give us another insight as to what she was possibly thinking and what her situation must have felt like to her at the time. So with all of this, it probably seemed like to Melody that possibly, instead of getting divorced with Gary, maybe murder was a better alternative. Not only that, there's a particular phone call that happened between Rusty and Melody that was very, very strange and somewhat horrifying. On the morning of the 4th of July, Melody calls Rusty. He picks up the phone thinking, it's one of their usual check-ins where they're just catching up with each other, saying good morning, how's your day, what are you gonna do, blah, blah, blah. But when he picks up the phone, Melody just says, he's in the burn pile. That's it. She doesn't elaborate. She doesn't say more than that. And Rusty immediately says, don't tell me anything more. I don't want to hear it, and hangs up. Now, after that phone call, he's just kind of there in a bit of a shock. I mean, he's horrified. What does that mean? He's in the burn pile. What could she possibly be talking about? And then when his remains were found and this investigation kind of blew up, it was all over the media because of just like how well known this family was in the community and because of their wealth. When Rusty found out, he knew he had to tell investigators about that phone call. Even though they were having an affair and she was cheating on her husband, which is never good, it seemed like Rusty really loved Melody, but he still told investigators everything that happened. And now it's very, very clear to them who killed Gary. On July 2019, after a year of investigation, Melody Ferris was arrested and charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, concealing the death of another, and making false statements. Investigators spent around a year analyzing phone records, family testimonies, and forensic evidence. They really dived deep into this case to make sure that they had everything that they needed to prosecute. Now, prosecutors believed that the killing happened inside the main house on the Ferris farm property. They said that Melody possibly used farm equipment to move Gary's body from the house to the burn pile. Because of his huge size, everyone was very stumped at how someone could possibly move it. If you look at Melody, she's a pretty small person in comparison to him. So throughout the trial, it was a huge question as to whether or not she was actually capable of moving the body on her own. And her defense team was really trying to play the role of, no, she's not capable, she can't do this and whatnot. But prosecutors said, well, they have an RTV, they have other vehicles on the property that she could have used to drag his body. And this is, commonly used around the farm for moving really heavy things. So that is not that far-fetched. But the defense argued that this case is entirely circumstantial. They said that there is no eyewitness to the murder. There's no direct physical evidence linking Melody to the shooting. First of all, she was cleared of accelerants. There was also no murder weapon ever found. Yes, there was a mention of a pistol by Scott, but otherwise, they couldn't actually find the gun that had shot and killed Gary. So the defense decided to focus their attention onto Scott Ferris. They claimed that he had access to farm equipment as well. And not only that, he is actually physically capable of moving Gary's body, unlike Melody. And they also suggested that he had all of this, financial and family tensions with Gary, kind of implying that he had motive as well. The major point for the defense was mostly the absence of a murder weapon. It's super vital in homicide trials that there's, a murder weapon, but because there wasn't one, they really emphasized the fact that, Melody couldn't have done it because there's just no direct link. There's nothing there that's like tying her directly to Gary's death. It's all very circumstantial, as they were saying. But the prosecutors argued that the gun was probably, disposed of or hidden after the crime happened, especially on a huge property like that. Maybe someone even drove out of bounds and threw the gun away or got rid of it. So unfortunately, a murder weapon was just never established during the trial. So the trial officially begins 6 years after Gary's death on October 2024 in Cherokee County Superior Court. And during this trial, the jury heard testimonies from all of the Ferris children, investigators, forensic experts, and Amanda, the youngest child of the family, was the only person to maintain Melody's innocence. All of the other children, Scott, Chris, and Emily, believed that their mother was clearly guilty of this crime, and they fully believed that she was the one responsible for killing Gary. Amanda took the stand and said that she doubted her mother could do something like this, that she wasn't capable of it, and she actually kind of suggested that Scott could have possibly been involved. And this is a clear act of opposing her siblings. There was already tension in the family throughout this whole case, not to mention the fact that they had to wait 6 years for a trial. It was very heated between all the siblings, and the fact that Amanda was the only one to stand by her mother's side. Melody was, of course, really happy about this. She was heartbroken to see, her kids take the stand and go against her, but considering the fact that she's on trial for murdering their dad, I don't blame them, clearly. But Amanda said that she was devastated by all of this and that she believes her mom is truly innocent until proven guilty. But the fact that Amanda took the stand and basically said that she's on her mother's side, it shocked everyone. But there's something even more shocking that happened after that. Melody had a chance to give a final statement to the court after the guilty verdict. After some deliberation, the jury did find Melody guilty on all counts, convicted on malice murder and related charges, and then sentenced to life in prison. But throughout all of this, she maintained her innocence. And in her final statement, instead of expressing remorse or, showing guilt for her actions, she said she was innocent and then decided to accuse her Scott one last time of being the one responsible for killing Gary. The entire courtroom was in shock. You can see Scott sitting in the back row and his face just drops after everything she had put him and their entire family through, after being the one to take their dad away from them and to split their family up. She points the finger at her son one last time, and she claimed that investigators had focused on the wrong person. When I was researching this case and I saw bits from the trial, I thought that was absolutely insane, and it really goes to show the type of person that Melody is. After everything, the investigation, the trial, and the verdict, one thing remains really, really clear about this case: that Gary Ferris is gone. And the family he built on that quiet Georgia farm will never be whole again. I'm going to be honest with you guys, I feel so sad for Gary. He genuinely seemed like a really good dad, and he did the best that he could to provide for his kids. He gave everyone everything as much as he could. And it's just so sad to see that that's like how he ended up. I personally think Melody belongs in prison for the rest of her life. But what did you guys think about today's case? How do you guys think Melody possibly managed moving Gary's body to the burn pile? What do you guys think about the trial? Do you have any thoughts about the fact that Amanda was the only one who stuck by Melody's side? If you have any thoughts, feel free to comment down below. Thank you for taking the time to watch today's video. If you found it informative, don't forget to leave a like or subscribe. And yeah, share any thoughts that you have down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.